Hey everyone, this is John from EastCoastArmory.com, and I'm here today with a project update video for this 1/6 scale radio-controlled Armortek Russian T34 85 medium tank. Since the previous video, a lot more detailed parts have been designed and fitted in place, and in this video we're going to be going over all of the detail modifications and add-ons that were added to the model to get it up to the condition that we have here. So stay tuned because there's going to be a lot of cool content coming right at you. To kick this video off, we have a bunch of new products and new detail components for the T34. The first batch are the parts that we have right here on the table. And actually, this is going to be true for all the parts I'm going to be mentioning in this video. These are actually some of the more trickiest and hardest parts geometrically to design, but I was able to muscle my way through. And let's just go ahead and kick it off with the set that we have here, which is the new ECA 3D printed T34 exhaust manifold set. This here is a new set that has just been listed to the ECA catalog, and if you were a fan of the ECA Facebook page, which I definitely recommend you checking out if you aren't already, these are something that I actually went ahead and previewed a little while ago, just waiting for the parts to be manufactured. And as it generally is the case, it takes a little while for the parts to actually come in, but here we go. We have a big batch of parts, so here we have it right here, the very first item. Like I stated before, no point diddle-daddling further. This is the 1/6 scale T34 3D printed manifold set. And the T34 actually had a few different styles of covers and exhaust layouts, which, welcome to T34, it's just like Sherman, there tends to be a grab bag of a bunch of different parts. But the ones that we have here are replicating the stamped steel versions as opposed to the cast versions, and I'll go into that momentarily. Before I actually go into these parts here, I do want to mention what the kit originally gives you. Unfortunately, I don't have them on hand. They're somewhere in the very few part bags that are still left for this project. I'm not going to really dig it out right now, there's no point, but in a nutshell, the kit did originally supply you with some components to flesh out the tank with these parts here, but if anyone has been a fan of this project, you'll know that the parts that are supplied with the kit are very, very rudimentary and basic. Again, enough to get you off the ground, but it does leave some room for improvement, which prompted me to again design the sets that we have here. So for the exhaust manifold covers, these were just a hunk of CNC aluminum that were just milled to roughly the shape that we have here. A little bit rough on the edges, but basically what you see is what you get. And for the exhausts themselves, just a pair of copper tubes. To secure everything in place, use the metal fasteners and you're good to go. Rather than using those, I went ahead and hit the drawing board and went ahead and cobbled together what we see here. By the way, the sets that are on the table are basically what we're going to have as production units. The only difference are the covers themselves. These ones here are made with an FDM type printing just for the use of a prototype, just to see if everything works out. The actual production units are going to be SLS nylon, the same material as both the fasteners and the exhaust stacks themselves. So that's the only difference between the two. The parts are currently listed on the ECA catalog, as are everything else I'm going to be mentioning in this video. But back to the sets that we have here, finally. Okay, so when it comes to the exhaust covers themselves, there are two patterns available. One is the stamped pattern, and the other are the cast pattern. For this one here, I went with the stamped pattern, and this here was the final outcome. I had a lot of really good references of the real T34s that are in museums, and I was able to get everything to the shape we have here because of that. So when I stated before the units are stamped, that's exactly what they are. This thing is just a flat panel of steel, really thick gauge steel, and ka-choomp, they press it to shape, giving you for the end result that you see presently. The other versions are made from cast and have a slightly different geometric pattern compared to this one here. Hopefully one day in the future I'll be able to revisit and actually make that version, but for the time being the stamped ones are the ones that are going to be on the ECA catalog. The piece here has all of the correct geometry for this piece, including the tombstone shaped back portion. The fastener locations are also in the appropriate location. The thickness of the unit is correct. Like I stated before, this was a very, very, very thick gauge steel that was heated and then twomped into shape. And because of that, we have all of the curvature that you would have from such of a manufacturing process. So everything is nice and curved on both the bottom as well as also on the interior, as you can see. Even the portion over here where it makes contact with the tombstone, it's all nice and radiused out. And the same can also be said about the top and the bottom portion. Everything is nice and smooth, again, indicative of the stamping process. As I mentioned before, these ones here are made with an FDM print. So in order to deal with the print lines, I actually went ahead and off camera coated the surface with some thick super glue, and then I just wet sanded it to the point that we have here, which makes for a nice smooth appearance. With the SLS stuff, that's not going to be necessary, as I always opt for the processed version, which does have a smooth surface straight from the get-go. So that's one thing that you don't have to worry about. On this one here, I was a little overzealous with the cleanup, and I accidentally poked a hole through the piece. This is hollow. It does have a honeycomb in it, and I did accidentally cut off a little too much, but this is something I just plugged up with some red putty. I'm going to polish down off camera. No point really mentioning any further. Obviously, the SLS stuff, that's not going to be necessary. The other things to mention are the fasteners. As you can see, this set contains a bunch of faux fasteners here. They are the correct size, shape, and thickness for the ones used to secure these to the real T34. So these are going to be much more realistic compared to using just standard off-the-shelf M3 fasteners. You can still do that, by the way, if you so desire. But for this one here, I'm just going to roll with these ones just to keep things in scale. As for the supply fasteners, you get more than enough to secure these to the tank, and you do have 2 left over as spare, just in case. The next thing to mention are the exhaust stacks themselves. These here are also very closely copying the real one as much as possible. So first we'll talk about the geometric shape. The units have this distinctive shape that we have here, and this is very different compared to the copper ones that are supplied with the kit, just with the way they have to bend the copper tubes in order to get a similar result. Also, one thing that was lifted directly from the real example is the center spline that we have right here on the top portions. On the real units, this would be left over from the manufacturing process when they would roll the sheet steel into the tube structure, and then they would just crimp and weld everything in place, much along the lines we see today on exhaust manifolds, or just mufflers and other things along those lines. The one other thing, and most important thing to point out, is that you'll notice that the things are printed hollow. Yes, they are. So with this design, you can patch this into a smoke system, and you can have the units puff away without any sort of extra modification need to be made to hollow them out or anything else along those lines. And that's all there is to this set over here. After filming, I'm going to go ahead, finish sanding this guy down once the putty is fully set, pre-prime, paint, and then I'm going to get everything secured in place, and we'll cut across later to see what that looks like. But from here, let's go ahead and review the next new set of components that were designed for this model. Carrying along takes us to the next set of parts, and this is, in my opinion, one of the more iconic bit of details for the T34-85 family, and that is the tow hooks. The tow hooks that you see here, again, it's another new set added to the ECA catalog, and it's actually one offered in 2 options, and I'll go back to that in a moment. Again, if you're wondering, yeah, but John, doesn't the kit give you a set of tow hooks? What, the tow hooks are awful? The answer is actually no. The tow hooks that the kit supplies you with are actually fairly decent. The problem is that they're absolutely useless for a T34-85. The kit ones are made again of CNC aluminum. However, the pattern of hook that the kit originally gives you is a pattern which is more indicative of a very early production T34-76, namely like a T34-76 model 1940 or something along those lines. Very, very early design patterns. For a T34-76, which the kit originally had 2 options, you had that version and the 85, would be more or less okay. However, this one being rendered as a T34-85, completely useless, and they would not have been present. And even though there's a lot of wacky stuff with T34s, I am quite confident to say there was never a T34-85 fitted with that initial pattern of hooks. So a new set was going to need to be designed, and that's the set that we have here. And I just gotta say, the hooks are very misleading because these things are actually really hard to manufacture. Not manufacture per se, but definitely making CAD. A lot of wacky angles going on, and was one that took a little bit of time to go ahead and figure out. So here we have the set. Like I mentioned before, the set come in 2 options, and one option is with I believe an earlier pattern, or it's just one done by a different factory, and basically it looks identical to this one here, but the difference is that it doesn't have this rounded section and this little hole that is present on the top. This one obviously does. So both sets are available on the ECA T34 catalog, and both I believe are the exact same price, just one has just a slightly different top revision. Outside of the early production versions, or I should say the initial production versions of T34s, the set that we have here is more than adequate at working with all the other T34s in the family. Be it from the other versions of the T34-76 to the T34-85 to the SU-100 and so on and so forth. The sets contain all of the components here required to outfit a single vehicle. So we have 4 of the main hooks, and we also have 2 of each pattern of the tow cable lockups. I'll go into more information on this in a moment, but first let's start with the hooks themselves. So like I stated before, this unit here is the version with the divot that is present. However, this is actually built upon the other CAD file without that unit in place. So detailing wise, it's identical with the exception of that little extra geometry in this section here. The unit is fully detailed. It's the appropriate size, and it's got that nice chunky feel to it, which is again true to form to the real one. The real ones were made out of cast, and all of the geometric patterns are found in this one over here. There's no sharp edges, everything is nice and blunt, which again is true to form to the real vehicle. The unit's bottom base is pre-welded, as you can see right there, so no need to sculpt any weld beads are required. You just simply mark the location, drill the hole into the vehicle, and install the new unit. The pieces are made from the SLS nylon, and the surfaces are very, very smooth on them. So once the pieces are painted, they will look true to form to the real counterpart. From the claws takes us to the tow cable locks, and this is the setup that we have here. So with the way the unit is designed is that we have this unit fastened to the, or I should say on the real one, welded to the hull, and this is where you would take the tow cable and clip it into place. Well, to prevent the tow cable eye from backing out, they have this little spring-loaded latch mechanism that we have right here. And when it comes to these latches, there are about half a dozen different variants that are out there. And for this one here, I just picked the one that I had the most references of, and I went ahead and just went forward in that direction. Seriously, it is a target-rich environment when it comes to designing parts for these vehicles. Anyway, so you'll notice that there are 2 patterns of lockups. And one pattern is for the front and the other is for the rear. The unit for the front is a bit more larger in size, and note it has this distinctive hole found in the middle portion. On the real units, these would be made out of steel stampings. They just twomp them into shape, and then you have the bracket. The remainder of the bracket's geometry is as per the real ones that I had as reference, and just like with the hooks themselves, the weld beads are integrally printed on, so again, no sculpting work is required from the sets. As for the remainder of the piece, you'll see that we have here the actual locks themselves. And again, when it came to this part, they were about half a dozen that were available, and I just picked this variant. The real units are made from cast, or the real ones are just a single piece of cast steel, and then they hinge into this section over here into the bracket. The hinge pins are included with the set. They are 3D printed. However, if you feel so inclined, you can replace these out with a set of metal pins if desired. But at least the set does give you the hinge pins straight from the get-go. And on the topic of iconic detail parts for the T34, that takes us into the perfect segue to where we are at right now. And this is the 1/6 scale T34 bow MG detail set. This was probably the mother of all really hard, surprisingly hard things to design in terms of the mount and the ball mount and everything else in between. So it was actually a really good accomplishment, or I should say it was an excellent feeling accomplishment completing the set. And this was something I previewed a little while ago, and finally it's in hand, and I'm really excited to get this thing fleshed out and fitted in place. Of course, again, yes, the kit does supply you this. As for what this set contains, well, it's as rudimentary as one can imagine. So the blister itself, or I should say the mount, is literally nothing more than a cylinder that has been sliced in the back and drilled out. It is a solid chunk of aluminum. The ball itself, or I should say the MG mount, is missing, and you basically just have this perforated ring similar to the one that we have here get mounted on the front. And again, this is true to form for not so much the blister, but this type of design without the front shield is what we would expect to see on a very early pattern of T34 76, such as again the model 1940. But for anything that came afterwards, the Russians went ahead and developed the extra armor section that we have here just to give the unit a little bit more protection. As for the MG, you literally just get a little rod that sticks out of the front, facilitating the detailing of the bow MG. In my opinion, it is one of the weaker aspects of the T34 kit. However, it's definitely not something that would have been impossible to work with a few years ago. If I didn't have access to CAD work and 3D prints like I do today, chances are really likely I would have taken the stock blister, because it does have the basic shape, and just reworked it to the point where I essentially create the unit that I have here. And then I would have just cast it in resin and continue with my day. However, with the set here, this definitely has lots of improvements over the original metal one that I'll touch upon in a moment. So the first thing I'll say is that this set here is a multimedia set where we have components manufactured in a multitude of different materials. We have FDM for the blister, we have SLS for the bow shielded section, and we have HD resin prints for the MG as well as the retention ring. All three of the material choices were done on purpose for the use of just optimizing them for their best assets. So first I'm going to start with the largest component, which is the FDM choice on the main blister. Normally I would make this out of a SLS print. However, for this one here I rolled with a FDM, and this is important to note because generally on the ECA parts on the catalog, you don't really see a whole lot of my items made in FDM, because generally FDM is just a bit rougher and coarser in its external finish, and I prefer the finer texture found on the other manufacturing methods. However, there are a few items on the ECA catalog offered in FDM, and it's done on purpose, namely because of the size that the components are. It will either be way too cost prohibitive to produce them in the other materials, or it's just more feasible to produce them in this material because of the larger size that these pieces are manufactured in. A notable example would be the 1/6 scale King Tiger grenade guard, which is mounted on the bottom portion of the turret. That is an FDM print, and it's actually perfect for that application. And that, in my opinion, is probably the biggest weakness at this time with 3D prints. 3D printing is an amazing technology, and it's really just crazy, just the type of things I could produce and the scale I could produce them in these days and the quality. But the one thing where it does fall short is cast texturing. There are some things that 3D printing still hasn't really caught up to yet. In my opinion, cast texturing is definitely one of them. And so 3D print is good for a nice smooth surface, but if you want to have those nice casted imperfections, it's not really there yet. At some point, eventually we'll catch up, but for the time being, not so much. So rather than, again, going with that more expensive route, I went with the more cost-effective alternative with the use of FDM. So this is, by the way, for an FDM printer, my source that produces these is fantastic. I definitely have a lot of cool parts on the horizon coming from him, and as you can see, the surface is really, really good for FDM. It does have a few print lines, but very, very smooth compared to some of the other homebrew ones I've seen in the past. So this whole unit here is going to be having cast texturing added in place. I'm going to use the same technique that I mentioned in the other videos. And the other thing you'll see that the welds are not present on this. This is one of the few parts that are printed that do not have integral weld beads printed on, because with FDM it's good for a lot of things, but having the weld beads, it'll just look a bit rough, and after you try to smooth them out, it just doesn't come out all that great, in my opinion. So for something like this, it's just easier to just sculpt the welds on the old-fashioned way. So that's why this one here does not have that. However, once the cast texturing is added, it's definitely going to look great, and we'll see what that looks like in a second. Also, we'll see that the unit is hollow on the inside, and this is also a great departure compared to the kit original one, which was just solid aluminum. Because this is hollow on the inside, and also with the shape and geometry of some of the other parts, this allows the builder to potentially hook it up to a servo so you can have the thing pivot and have a little bit of extra animation. The next thing to mention is the ring that we have here. This here's the retention ring, and this is true to form to the real T34. It gets fitted into this section right over here, just slides right in. Note the tolerances are really, really tight. And this unit here, actually on the real unit, would hold the ball in place and allow the thing to pivot. Note it has all the appropriate geometry. It does stand off from the blister itself. And by the way, the blister does have, this was the hardest part, getting all the geometric shapes in place. It's not as easy as one may think, just a cylinder and you slice it. There's quite a lot going on over here, which was surprising when you're trying to design one. But as you can see, it has that nice curvature to it, and it's interrupted by the standoff section of this ring, which is exactly like the real unit. The unit does have its slot screw fasteners integrally printed on, And note that the slot screws are not in the same position. That's an easy way that you can actually make the model look a bit more boring. If you want to add a little bit more spice and realism to the build if you're in CAD, have the screws just aligned slightly different from one another. It's a way to just give a little bit more personality and life to the model. Another quick little tip. But anyway, the pieces are integrally printed on, so no drilling is required. Just drop the piece in place and you're good to go. The next thing to mention is the MG ball, and this here is made from SLS, and it's nice and smooth. The reason why I went with SLS with this because it's a single 3D printing. Trying to get this produced in FDM is a bit problematic, so I rolled with SLS on this one. But as you can see, it has all of the geometric shapes of the real one, including the shape of the internal ball section. The visor over here does have its conical shape, which is lifted directly from the real one. The armored section over here, which protects the gas system on the DT, is also here. It's thicker in the front as it would be on the real one. We have the protective wings. It is all as per the real units that I had cobbled together. Lots of images to go ahead and obtain. Also, with the piece being round like this, you can see that it is able to pivot from the get-go. And we also have a matching curvature fount right over here, so it's nice and precise, and the tolerances are very good with one another, and so the piece should be able to pivot once it's fully assembled, and that remains to be seen. The last thing to mention is the barrel section for the DT, and I went ahead and had some really good references of the unit, and we have here all of the appropriate details from the gas system. Right over here we have the gas plug, the gas block. We have the retention pins right there that secure the gas block in place. We also have the secondary gas, or the gas ring holder. Or I guess it's a gas tube holder if I'm not mistaken, but either way, all that is present here on the printing. On the front section, we have the wrench slit cutouts right over here, front and center. And we have the step down section for this area here. I have seen two options out there. Some are threaded and they have a conical flash suppressor fitted in place. Others have a thread protector, but this one here I left with the piece being threadless, as I've seen on real T34s. The unit, of course, is drilled out. It's not drilled out all the way through. This is something that I could potentially look into in case someone wants to hook up an LED on the inside. You could have the thing flash, and this is something that remains to be seen. But here we go. For this example here, the unit is fully detailed. As for why the gas section has this rounded section over here, this was so it could fit in place, but this is going to be subject to change because I realized something when I got the parts and I was inspecting them when they came from the printer, which I'll get to in a second. The other thing I wanted to mention is that, like I stated before, on the catalog, there are two options available. We have the standard MG version for the T34, but since the other files weren't too much, or I should say, since I already had the main mount, I went ahead and also designed the flamethrower version of the T34 MG section. If the vehicle was fitted with a flamethrower, it wouldn't have a bow MG. Instead, it would have the flamethrower unit. And that just repurposes the blister over here, but the front end is very different, and I actually will be throwing up pictures of the CAD files that I have for that design. That unit is also listed on the ECA catalog, and again, it can be found in the link in the video description below. Sadly, I'm not going to be building this vehicle as the flamethrower. If that build ever comes down and one day, I'll definitely be able to do it and make a video of it. But for the time being, you can see what the CAD files look like, and the unit is fully detailed, by the way, with the interior section of that little drum section. It's all hollow. The tube is on the inside just like the real one, and it was real fun going ahead and designing that setup. But either way, back to the one that we have here. Another new addition to the ECA T34 catalog is the set that we have right here. This here is the T34 3D printed front track mounting set. On the front armor plate of the T34, there are provisions for securing on a number of spare track links. And the way this is facilitated is that there are just a bunch of bosses that are welded to the armor plate that are threaded, and then the track links are fastened in place, utilizing the same holes on the track for the grousers that are a bolt-on accessory. Well, on the Armortek kit, none of these components are supplied. It's just basically a flat plate, and I think they want you to just bolt the track in place if memory serves. But either way, here we have a new set from ECA that gives you the appropriate detailing for these parts. So the set is all-encompassing, where we have the bosses that are pre-welded, and we also have the fasteners with the washer detailing integrally printed on. The units are designed, or I should say the units are designed off of a real T34 that had some really good references on, and from there I was able to extrapolate the detailing that we see here. As I mentioned before, the pieces are pre-welded, so no sculpting is going to be required, going there with a screwdriver and all that stuff. Nope, not needed. Just drill a hole into the tank, glue the piece in place, and you're essentially good to go. The set here is made out of SLS white nylon. However, the firm that I use to produce these parts and a large number of my components is no longer in operation, sadly, and because of that, I had to find some other sources. I do have another firm that does SLS printing. However, this may or may not be able to be produced depending on a factor or two in SLS. If that's the case, I'll just have these components made in a nylon resin type material, which is basically here. I believe it's nylon. It might be some other type of polymer, but like this set here which is for a 50 cal set. This one was originally made out of SLS. However, this now is made out of this new material here from my other vendor. The material is flexible, a lot like the original SLS's, but it's not nearly as durable as the SLS. But the detail fidelity is on par, if not better, than the HD material that I also had a bunch of other parts produced in. So, depending on the situation, the pieces may still be made out of SLS, or I might switch over to this material here. Either way, the pieces are listed on the ECA catalog. So, back to the parts in question, we have more than enough for a full set for the T34. The T34 only utilizes 6 of these bosses, and you have an extra 2 just in case you need a spare for one reason or another. The front portion of the T34 has a bunch of track links, 5 in total, and here you can see the layout on the table. As I mentioned before, the fasteners are designed to mount onto these little holes that we have here on the toothless portion of the T34 track. On the real vehicle, these here are provisions for mounting on bolt-on track grousers, so the Russians went ahead and just utilized this as the perfect location to secure their spare track links to the front of the vehicle. The set here is designed for use specifically on the Armortek T34 track link, so the pins here should fit in their appropriate location. It's going to be interesting to see how that pans out. Yep, as you can see, the piece just drops directly in. Once the pieces are fitted in place, you can see that it gives the detailing of the fastener with the washer in its location, and even if you leave the pieces off, you have the boss detailing with the welds present, and you may or may not even just leave the piece with the fastener hanging out, depending on the look that you're going for with your build. The way the pieces are designed, they're nice and deep, and the piece will just sit in like this. So there's plenty of room on the inside for the stem to descend from the fastener. And in order to secure this to the tank, you drill out a portion on the vehicle that's the size of the larger stem over here, and this will allow the piece to glue in place securely, and then this piece here can just top it off for the final detailing. Turning my attention to the next portion of the build is going to be adding some of the details to the side and frontal armor sections. And on the T34-85, there are these, lack of a better word, bosses or these bars that are welded to the upper extremities. One are on each side of the armor plate, and the other one's located on the front armor plate. To fabricate these, I'm going the old school way, where I'm making it out of chunks of plastic. I'm going to cut them to shape, glue them to the side of the model, and then add the appropriate welds. While fabricating the part, here I have a section of plastic rods that are glued together, or I should say plastic strip, and I already measured out the portion on the hull, and I went ahead and cut the pieces accordingly. Unfortunately, I didn't have enough stock on hand to do the job, so I had to be a little creative, and to do that, I have what we see here on the vise. So in order to make the pieces, they need to be solid. And the piece isn't exactly a square, it's actually a triangle in shape. And obviously there's going to be a lot of material that are going to be ground off this chunk over here in order to get that shape. But luckily I had lots of plastic angle on hand, so I'm just going to go ahead and make the angle into the part. But to do so, like I mentioned before, it needs to be solid. Obviously the angle isn't. So what I went ahead and did was I busted out an old trick that I knew, where I took sections of plastic stock and I glued them to each side of the channel over here, or the angle section, and then from here I'm going to go ahead and fill in the inner portion with resin. The two sections on the end act as a dam, and they'll prevent any sort of the resin from overflowing. Once the resin sets, the piece is now solid and I can actually work on it from there. This technique isn't just going to be done to one of these units, but I'm actually doing it to two of them, which I have the other one here off camera. From here, I'm going to go ahead, get the resin mixed, pour it into these sections, and then after a little bit of time, the thing will be solid, and I could progress with the next portion of the procedure. So as I mentioned before, there is a small little quirk that I didn't see when I was designing the thing in CAD, but I definitely encountered it when I was test fitting the components, and that has to do with fitting the MG in place. So when it came time to fitting this unit in, yeah, to quote Elon,
room for improvement.
So that is something I'm going to be making to this example over here, and the production units will have this addressed. And the production units will have this section here cut out, which, by the way, is true to form to the real one. I was looking at, found another picture of someone who took a picture of one from underneath over here, and yes, that is true to form, so it makes sense. I mean, how are you going to get the thing fitted in place? But this is going to be carved out over here, and on the DT section, this is also going to be straightened out and elongated. So the piece will fit in much better compared to the first gen pre-production version that I have here. However, the remainder of the detailing is going to be exactly the same. So the very first thing I'm going to do is to add the cast texturing here to the MG blister. And to do that, I'm going to use my tried and true technique, which is the use of red putty. This here is just USC red glazing and spot putty. This stuff, well, one, this tube has definitely been used a lot, as you can see. However, the link to this can be found at the Amazon link below, and that's where I buy my stuff from. This, by the way, is the same putty I use on all of my models, be it from 1/6 scale to 1/35 and even smaller, and it's used for not just cast texturing, it's also used for just putty work. If I have to plug up a hole, delete seams, take care of any sort of other type of bodywork issues, this here is my go-to stuff. The stuff is pre-mixed, which is why I like it. They do have types of glazing and spot putty I've seen in auto storage where it's a two-part mix. I stay away from that stuff. It's not really great for plastic models. However, I have used it in the past in regards to needing to fill some holes in an expedient and fast manner. And that, if that's the case, that stuff does work pretty well. Matter of fact, on the Jumbo that I'm also working on at this time, I've actually utilized that stuff on several areas of the bodywork. But outside of that small niche, it's not really used very often for my builds. And for cast texturing here, it's definitely a no-go. This is the best stuff to use. Pre-mix, just apply it and let it dry. So as for the application, I'm going to utilize my finger, as I've done in other videos. And I definitely should have enough putty left in here to do the job. So I just take the stuff and I smear it on with my finger, as you can see. One thing that's nice about the FDM, because it has those little ribs on it, it actually holds the red putty very well. And I'm just going to go ahead and smear the stuff in place. When I'm smearing the stuff, remember, you want to get this is going to be the type of thing you're going to accomplish in about 2 layers. The first layer is just a prelim, and it's just to get the thing coated, and then the steppling is generally done in the second coat. But even with the first coat, I'm still achieving what I call the rub. So if you ever look at parts that are cast or that are casted, they tend to have this type of an appearance to them, like you see here. The cast texturing tends to be broken up into 2 types. We have the rub type texture, and then there's the steppling texture. And in some cases, it does have both. And as for what technique to use and where to use it, that's best if you look at the real one and you could determine very quickly. Also, of course, some countries' castings are better than others. The American castings tend to be very smooth and are actually very good. The Russians are stereotypically known to be just god-awful. And believe it or not, the Germans aren't that great either. The World War II tanks specifically, their castings were really almost on par with the Russians in many cases. I'm going to piss off some Verboos with that one, but if you ever seen a Tiger one or a Panther in person, look at the engine grills and even look at the mantlets. They're not exactly that greatly casted, or I should say smoothly casted. They were pretty rough. I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but you know, it's just a data point, something to keep in mind. So as you can see, it's smeared on now. When the stuff starts to set, it starts becoming a bit clunky, which again, you can work with like I am over here. As you see, I'm just lightly glazing or sliding my finger over these areas, and you can see how it's causing this stuff to smear and have some extra texturing happening. And normally, if this was an American build, I would have stopped at this point. But again, it's Russian. Roughness is not a... It's actually... what's the phrase? It's not an error, it's actually a feature. So that's definitely something to keep in mind. So from here, I'm just going to go ahead and let the first layer dry. And after it dries, I could go ahead and either do some refining or make it look a bit chunkier. That depends, again, on the look I'm going for. But there we have it. As you can see, the piece is already transforming into something that looks more true to form. And you can see why I opted for FDM as opposed to going with the SLS. After about an hour or so, the putty has set, and at this point here, I'm ready to do the next step. This, again, is optional, depends on how the coating came out the first time around. May warrant or not warrant the use for the next step. So again, this is all up to your personal discretion. But this one here, let's just see what it looks like. So we have some clunks over here. It's fairly smooth over here, but we, again, have some texturing. For a Russian tank, this actually should be suffice. However, I am just going to go ahead for good measure and go with a second coat. Before I do that, though, I am going to lightly just hit the surface with some sandpaper. What is this, I think 300 grit, if I'm not mistaken? The idea to this is to refine the surface and to reduce the size of some of the clunk that remains. Again, up to the discretion. If this was an American tank, I would be focusing more on smoothing these out, which will then prep the surface for the next top coat, which should do the job. But for a Russian tank like this, I'm actually going to not do too much refinement because, again, you kind of want to keep that. It's part of the charm of building a Russian tank. So here we go. Polishes down a little bit. Perfect. All right. From here, I'm going to go ahead and add the second top coat. Same exact procedure. A little bit of red putty. Smear this stuff in. Only this time I'm going to go ahead and add the stepling. Because it's on the surface of other red putty, it's going to react a bit differently compared to the first time around when it was applied directly to plastic. Because this stuff is tooling based, when it was applied to the plastic, it starts melting the plastic, and that's why we have the effects of the outcome that we saw before. When that stuff is already set, it becomes a barrier, and it allows then for the second coat to be applied, and when you're applying the second coat, it feels a bit differently. It will also do this to metal too, not so much melting it, but generally when you're putting it on for the first time, it acts differently compared to the second and tertiary coats. As you can see, now I'm going to be adding more of a stepling to the surface as well as the drag. See? Just like so. And that's how I achieve the drag look as well as the stepling results that you see on my cast texturing models, being in all the different scales that I work in. And it's also kind of funny that since I started showing this technique, it kind of has become like the de facto way on a lot of message boards out there, as well as also a lot of Facebook groups, specifically the 1/6 scale ones, when I see a lot of people working on their 1/6 scale models of one flavor or another, and they're adding the cast texturing, and it's like, oh boy, that technique kind of looks familiar now, does it? So I'm watching you guys. I know you guys are getting influenced by my videos, and that's why I post this. It's a good thing. That's kind of why I'm here in the community. But anyway, here you go. Just go ahead and stipple this stuff up. And as you can see, once you've done it enough times as I have, it becomes just second nature. Okay, so there you go. You can see once the stepling is added, hopefully you get some focus, and now that looks casted. So, and like I stated before, this is the type of technique, or I should say, this is the type of outcome you just can't really get from a 3D printer. Or at least, definitely FDM. Maybe resin print, but still, it's really hard to articulate this and get this type of result. Perhaps in the future, maybe 5 or 10 years from now, perhaps the resolutions will get good. Specifically with resin 3D printing, you could probably pull this off. But even in injection molded polystyrene, it's kind of difficult for a lot of companies to go ahead and have the texture on the surface. A lot of the older kits, they would have textured surface because they would actually apply that to the masters before they go ahead and make the molds. But that's a topic for another day. Either way, as you can see, the texturing has been added. I think I'm done. I'm not going to add a tertiary coat. I don't see a need to. And from here, I'm just going to clean up the sides a little bit because it'll just make the piece a little bit cleaner and also be a better surface to add the welds when the thing gets fitted to the model. But before I do that, I'm just going to let this thing dry. Probably hit it with a shot of primer, and then I can continue from there. With the texturing out of the way on the mount itself, it's time to turn my attention to the MG section. And as I mentioned before, the middle section needs to be removed in order for the barrel to be slid in place. As you can see, I simply marked it out with a marker, and then from this point here, I'm going to go ahead, put this on the mill, and just mill this section out. Again, this is only being done to this pre-production sample over here. Production units are going to have this already completed. As I mentioned before, in order to remove the material, I'm going to utilize my mill, which actually is a piece of equipment that hasn't really been seen all that much in recent videos. With the proliferation of the 3D printed parts that I've been designing in recent years, this old girl, it's not exactly being used as much as it used to be. Back when I was doing everything by hand, doing things the old-fashioned way with handmade masters, yeah, this thing and the lathe were my go-tos along with my bandsaw. But these days, it's still used, but not nearly as much, which I guess it's okay because this machine is getting kind of old now. But that doesn't mean it still can't make chips, which is exactly what we're going to do right now. I already set the depth. I have the thing anchored into the vise. Squeeze that baby in there, make it nice and tight. Okay, let's see how this works. Okay, looks like it did the trick. The nylon heats up pretty quickly and melts around the piece just like some injection molded plastic, but it holds its shape pretty well. As you can see, it milled it out pretty nicely. And the residual should clean up very well with just some scrapes with an X-Acto, maybe a little bit of sandpaper. Unlike with FDM, where it has like a honeycomb or space-saving type interior layout, with the SLS, it is solid material. It's very similar to the old cast resin in that regard. This material is also very abrasive resistant. Like I said before, some sandpaper. Then I realized, yeah, this stuff doesn't really like to be sanded. It kind of lasts at sandpaper. But scraping with an X-Acto, that's another story. And the blue surface from the Crayola markers making a mess of things, but that should clean up pretty easily. Let me just... Okay, so it's nice and hollowed out. Let's take the MG barrel, slide it in. There we go. Slides right in place. There we go. I like the way the barrel's nice and centered right there. It has very realistic looking results. And it's going to really look great after everything is painted. And after everything was cleaned out, I went ahead and just temporarily pre-assembled everything. And as you can see, it came out better than I could possibly have imagined. The piece is fully pivotable, like you can see right here. And try to figure out how I can hook this up to a servo so that I could go ahead and have the animation of the thing pivoting when the turret's rotating, like I generally do on my builds. But as you can see, so far, definitely so good. Well, at least until the barrel gets glued in. Right now it's running around loose. But as you can see, it is a really nice component, and it's going to really make the front pop extremely well. Jumping to the front plate, here we have the location where the tracks are going to be fitted in place. What I carefully did was I, off camera, aligned the track on exactly where the components need to be fitted in place. Fortunately, with the way the things are drilled out, you just have to mark these sections here with a pencil, and now you have your lines to, or I should say your points where you can go ahead and center punch and drill accordingly. However, one tip is that you can't just use a regular pencil because of the thickness of the track link over here. A point is just not going to be able to penetrate through all this metal to make contact with the armor itself. So what I do is I take a mechanical pencil like this, which allows you to go ahead and open the graphite up to the point where it's nice and long over here, which will give you enough clearance to go through the track link and make contact to make your mark onto the armored section itself. From this point here, I'm going to go ahead, center punch all the holes, drill them out, and then secure the new pieces in place. And here's the installation of the bosses now with the pieces drilled out. That was done with the drill that we have right over here. So I drill out the hole, and then it's just time to install the pieces. Now, the fit on the parts are pretty snug into the metal, which is exactly what you want. You want the tighter the tolerances, the better. As for putting it in place, I put a little drop of super glue on the location, insert the part, and then with a little assistance here from a rubber mallet, I'm able to tap the piece into place. And this is, again, one of the areas where it's part of the charm on a T34. You don't have to pay attention too much to the squareness of the part to make sure it's dead on accurate. Making sure that the piece is squared like these two over here. You can have one that's slightly off. Again, T34 gonna T34, and it becomes part of the territory. So I'm gonna go ahead and get this one on camera right here. As you can see, I put a little drop of glue into the recesses there. Take the mounting boss, line it up, just eyeball it, make sure that it's nice and square. And from here, we'll tap, 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 and we are good to go. Obviously, this is best done like this with the SLS. I wouldn't want to do that with the resin, but you get the idea. If the tolerances are really tight, and if it's the resin one, I recommend just removing a little bit more material off of the hole itself with the drill, or possibly even going up and down the stem here with an X-Acto, just so that the tolerances are opened up where the piece can slide in a bit easier. But with the old school SLS over here, that is definitely not the case. And there we go. The bosses are now mounted in place, and as you can see, it's fleshing out the front hull very nicely. And here's the track link segment with the fasteners added in place. Of course, it's just held on temporary at this time. Towards the end of the build, I will secure these on permanently, thus completing the look. But as you can see, it has the appropriate look for the model in question. We have the nice fastener details right there, and we also have the appropriate standoff from the hull, again, much along the lines of the real vehicle. Part of the reason why I installed these at this time, well, one, I need to do it, but the other reason is that I can now mount on the hooks. With the way the front area is over here, there's a lot going on with the caps, the MG, as well as the hatch, which is to be announced. And I want to go ahead and make sure that the track rack is mounted first before I go ahead and start fiddling around with the hooks. And with that out of the way, I can now make the appropriate measurements required to get these pieces fitted in place. Once everything is marked out, I could go ahead and commence with the mounting procedure of the mounting hooks that were referenced earlier. Here's what they look like fitted in place. As you can see, the hook is fitted as well as the little retention clip. One thing that I do want to mention on the clip is that there is some kind of a spring mechanism that's used, and it keeps this unit in the open, or I should say in the closed position like this, and it works kind of like a jewelry clasp. However, all of the surviving examples of T34s that I've been able to track down, they either have the spring completely missing, or the piece is just completely broken and damaged to the sands of time. So for the love of me, I honestly don't really know how it works. I have some ideas, I've seen some remnants that are left, but this is one of those things where unless I actually visit a intact example of a T34 in person, actually get a chance to study the thing, that's really the best chance I'm going to be able to see how to reverse engineer it. But for the time being, the way you see it is basically like many of the other T34 examples that are out there. So the clamp, or the hook, is fitted in place. Like I stated before, it's pre-welded, so once the piece is drilled out, just shove the piece in and let the adhesives do its thing. And here you get to see that little mechanism right there. Like I stated before, this allows you to take the tow hook eye from the tow cable, clip it in place into this section here, and then this would spring up, locking it in, preventing it from backing out. Here's the unit, of course, found on the front portion. As I mentioned before, there are about 24 different versions of this mechanism, and I just picked the one here that I had the best references of. You can see what it looks like on the opposite side. Also, the bow MG has been temporarily just fitted in place. Unfortunately, even though I would love to install that in this video, I need a couple servos to come in for both the MG as well as for the other fittings on the vehicle, so that's going to have to be something that's going to be referenced in the next video. But the only thing that means is that you'll see another T34 video coming sooner than later, so that's a win, I suppose. But outside of the MG, the last thing to focus on is going to be the driver's hatch, which I have been messing with in CAD, getting the dimensions and all that other stuff, and as you can clearly see, that's really all that's left on the front plate here to get the entire front portion of the vehicle done. I really love how these hooks came out. They just give the front just so much extra detailing compared to the original ones, which were okay, again, for a model 1940, but this being an 85, these patterns here are definitely much more accurate. The spare track bosses also complete the front area here. It fills in very nicely, along with those mounting sections for the tin work that I touched upon in the other video, along with the front idler tension cover caps. Aside from the front section, I also was working on the side armor details. This side here is pretty much ready to go and it's all fleshed out. The only thing that's required is for me to sculpt on some welds, which will be added when I go ahead and get this guy fitted in place permanently, and I need to sculpt the welds around this area over here. When I take care of that, I'll circle around and wrap up the welds over here, but you get to see the details in this format. So over here we have those sections of plastic that I mentioned before. They were angle sections that were filled in with resin, sanded down so I could get a triangle type shape. Once everything was sanded, it was glued directly to the side of the hull over here. On the real vehicle, there are 3 of these. There's the 2 on the sides. There's another one right here on the front leaning edge. This is going to be added after the front hatch section is taken care of, and that's something I'm going to circle back to. But as for what these are, I believe these are locations for the crew to actually put their feet so they could climb onto the vehicle. With the way the T34 is, there's not really a whole lot of surface area over here, specifically with the 85 with the larger turret, so I believe they added these sections just so it gives the crew members just a little bit of extra places to place their feet when climbing and disembarking off the vehicle. As you can see, the same detail was also done to the opposite side. The other thing that I added on this side here are the grab handles that we have here on these 3 locations. These were lifted directly from the Tamiya example, as well as I've seen lots of other real examples with these features in place. And by the way, again, this is just where it comes down to T34s, because I've seen like a bunch of different variations on different type of grab handle layouts, tool layouts. There's just so much variations out there. In a way, it's a good thing. You could just basically just go pick one and go in that direction. You should be more or less accurate. And for these ones here, these handles were all fabricated out of steel rod, bent to shape, drilled into the corresponding locations, and then glued in place. Again, the welds will be added momentarily. On these sections over here, we have those Russian type tie-down points, same like the ones over here. On the real unit, these, I believe, are for securing in place some track gougers. But to do that, we have some hooks on the tin work, and the other hooks would be on the side of the tank. These ones here were bent out of 1/16 of an inch floor wire to the appropriate shape, and then fitted to the model. And one thing that I did, I drilled into the model on these 2 locations, so the metal rod is not just glued to the vehicle, it's actually plugged into the model. And this is something that I like to do on many other builds that have features similar to this, specifically American tanks with the way the tool tie-down straps are. If you just take some metal, bend it, and glue it to the side of the model like you would on a 135, it's not really going to hold up all that well. Specifically, if you're going to tie straps to it, and this being an RC tank, you do want that extra bit of strength. So one trick that I learned many years ago, and it's one that it's a great way to hack, and it's a bit of an illusion, is you actually drill holes into the vehicle, and this allows you to install the wire, which visually will give you the detailing, and then once you add the sculpted welds, any sort of trace of the hole is completely eliminated, giving you the illusion that the handle here is welded directly to the vehicle. And again, this is something I've incorporated on many vehicles in the past, and M10 is definitely one of them. If you see one of my M10s, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about in regards to the side turret little tie downs. On the opposite side, we have basically the same type of setup with the foot section as well as with the grab handles, but on this side there are more grab handles compared to the reverse, and also there's going to be a lot more extra details that are going to be added to this side in regards to the saw, I believe a shovel, and the headlight and soldering cluster, which will be located in this section over here. The tin work is basically complete. There are these toolboxes that get fastened to the sides, and these are something that are currently in CAD. Once I have them in hand fitted in place, that'll be the topic in another upcoming video update. But rest assured, it's happening, and like I said before, the sides are fleshing out very, very nicely. In fact, these sections here are probably going to be wrapped up in the next video or so. And this brings us to the rear. So here we have the rear detailing, and essentially the back plate is done, with the exception of the exhausts that are not yet fitted on permanently, and I'll go over that in a moment. But if I go down over here, you can see the bottom tow cable points. Again, you just mark the correct locations, drill them out, and the pieces go on like a dream. And you can also see those retention clips again, right over here, fully functional, of course. They really give the build just that much added extra accuracy as well as detailing. And also, it's really beneficial that everything has their welds pre-printed on, because again, it saves a boatload of time in having to sculpt stuff. So moving upward takes us to the engine hatch. This was something that I mentioned in the last video. And also in the last video, I mentioned that there was a small little seam that was where the plastic insert for the flange here made contact with the rear plate. And this was taken care of with a little bit of body work. Some epoxy was put in those sections over there and then sanded down to the appearance that we see here. Once everything is painted, it should look the part, and of course the piece just closes absolutely perfectly without any issues. And this leads us to the exhaust manifolds. So at the moment, the exhaust manifolds are done, they're pre-painted, and I need to add the plumbing to them, which I need some fittings for that are still on the way from Amazon. As soon as they come in, I could complete the plumbing, and then once that's done, these pieces can get affixed on permanently. But even though they're not yet installed permanently just yet, you really get an idea on exactly what they look like fitted in place. And as I stated before, the back section here, once these pieces are fitted on permanently, is essentially done. I mean, there's nothing literally else to add to these areas outside of the blower, but that's considered top detailing, which, by the way, if anyone's a fan of the ECA Facebook page, you'll know that I actually completed the files for this, and yes, that is currently in production right now as I'm recording. So expect that to pop in a upcoming video, more than likely the next one. With the turret placed back on, you get to appreciate the model in this format here. And again, like I always state in these videos at this point, it's further along, and it's another step closer to final completion. And this one here, again, I'm literally working on the final CAD files. Once those CAD files are in hand, there's nothing stopping me from getting this thing painted and then across the finish line. But of course, more information on that is to come in the next video. And with that, that wraps up this project update video for this 1/6 scale radio-controlled Armortek Russian T34 85 medium tank. If you like this video, be sure to subscribe to this channel, where it's a great way to keep up to date on new posted content, being 1/6 scale project update videos like this one here, or the other smaller scale model showcase videos that frequently get posted to this channel. Another way to keep in the loop of new posted content is by liking us on Facebook. There, I have more photographs of this particular build that have been posted since the project start, along with photographs of the other smaller and larger scale builds that have been seen on this channel previously. Furthermore, don't forget to swing by eastcoastarmory.com for more 1/6 and 1/16 scale builds and detail components. Thanks again. I'll be seeing you all again on the next one. Till then.